Welcome back to another FIDE World Blitz Championship, and we have a very great matchup between two amazing players. The greatest chess player of all time, Magnus Carlsen, going up against everyone's favorite chess streamer, Hikaru Nakamura, and the players have opted for a classical variation of the French defense. White has a lot of space in the center, as you can see with all the pawns on d4, e5, and f4. But what black is going to do is they're going to expand on the queen side, and also they're going to play some pawn moves in order to undermine that center. And Hikaru, he's played a crazy looking move. It's pawn to g5, but the point of this move is he wanted to distract the f pawn away from controlling the e5 square, and now e5 is ripe for the taking. So out of the opening, Hikaru has successfully neutralized white's space advantage, but it has come at a cost, because he has an isolated pawn on h7, his king is still stuck in the middle of the board, he's expanded on both the queen side and the king side, so it's not really clear where exactly black's king is going to go in this game. But for now, Hikaru, he's happy and content to just develop his bishops, 1 to b7, 1 to g7, arguing that if the position opens up, then these bishops are really going to come alive. And so Magnus, he's going to think about how he wants to play this. He starts with knight to e2, idea that he maybe wants to play knight to g3 and knight to h5, which would go after the dark squared bishop. Other ways that Magnus can try to play this game is that he can stack up on the semi-open f-file, where he can stare down at the weak pawn on f7. Now that pawn on f7 was guarded by the knight on e5, but Hikaru, he jumps the knight into g4, and he's going after the bishop pair. And if he can take away this dark squared bishop, then his bishop on g7 is really going to be a monster once things open up. Now, I think Magnus has a bit of a tactic here. He might be able to play pawn to g6, pawn sacrifice, and then whatever recaptures there, he can sacrifice some pieces to open up the position. While Magnus works out those complications, I just want to remind you that if you're enjoying the content so far, then you can consider subscribing as well as turning on notifications. That would mean a lot, thank you. And Magnus doesn't go for it. He goes for a calm move, king to h1, stepping away from that dark squared diagonal. Now that he's pushed the f pawn, his king might be a little bit weaker over there. Hikaru is happy to take away the bishop pair, and still, it's a question of where to put his king. He starts with queen to e7, cutting off any ideas of like knight to f5, because that e6 pawn was previously pinned, and now he's also leaving the option open to castle queenside. First, he starts with bishop to e5, just trying to prophylactically get out of the way of knight to h5, and Magnus, his position seems okay. It seems comfortable because he still has some space in the middle of the board, and black's king is quite weak, but he has to be precise. He starts with c3, which strengthens the knight in the middle of the board. I would have liked something more active, like rook a to e1 looked like a pretty reasonable move to me. Also knight to h5, and maybe eyeing the f6 square, that could have been reasonable as well. But c3 is a nice solid move, and that seems to be the name of the game for Magnus Carlsen so far. Now Hikaru, he has a very interesting looking option here, and that option is rook to g8. Now that looks like it temporarily gives up the h7 pawn, but I think white will be very hesitant to take that pawn, because that just opens the h-file towards the white king. And Hikaru, he's gone for the move rook to g8. He's eyeing the g5 pawn. He'd be happy to take with his rook, maybe castle queenside, and then stack up on the open g-file. And so Magnus, it's a question of whether he wants to defend the pawn, whether he wants to grab the pawn on h7. Maybe he could bring another rook into the game. Like I said, rook a to e1 could make some sense. Another idea could be to open things up on the queen side, so that he can start attacking this king in the middle of the board. The fact that Magnus is hesitating a little bit here and taking his time kind of tells me he's a little bit uncomfortable with his position. And rightfully so, because it's really not clear how white should continue. What Magnus really wants to do is he wants to open up the position in order to take advantage of the black king that's still stranded in the middle of the board. But he has no pawns in the center of the board to launch towards black's king, so it's really hard to open up some lines. He could try to open up lines on the queen side, but the king is in the middle of the board, not on the queen side. Now that still could help, But Magnus, he goes for the move pawn to h4. He's defending his g5 pawn. But I really don't like this move. It's really weakening. He's pushing pawns in front of the king. And now the pawn on h7 that was targeted by the light squared bishop can move up one square and really threaten to open up white's kingside. And look at that move from Magnus Carlsen. He plays knight to f5, sacrificing a piece, but he understands that he has to open up the position in order to attack black's king, which is just stranded in the middle of this board. Hikaru, he plays queen to c5 though, and Hikaru, he's taking control over the dark squares, and also he's trading off the queens. And without the queens, this attack against black's king is not as dangerous as Magnus Carlsen initially predicted. And we see there some shake of the head, some frustration by Magnus. This knight is now galloping into the position. First, Magnus, before anything, he takes the pawn on h6 with his knight, attacking the rook, also attacking the weak pawn on f7. Now remember, white's light squared bishop is hanging on d3, so he probably has to move it out of the way. He starts bishop to c2. f6 is now played by Hikaru. What a great move. Trying to undermine white's kingside pawns, also reinforcing the bishop. Magnus brings over his rook in order to pin the bishop along the e-file. So at some point, Hikaru is going to choose to move his king out of the way, I'm sure. Before that, he might consider maybe galloping the knight into the middle of the board, knight to e4. But Hikaru, he plays rook takes h6, understanding that his bishops and his knight, they're all better than the rooks that are placed on e1 and f1. Hikaru starts with king to e7, understanding that because we're in the endgame, his king is perfectly safe in the middle of the board, ready to join the rest of his pieces and hunting down these weak pawns on h6 and h4. Magnus Carlsen, he's putting his rook on h5, tying it down to defending these two weak pawns. But it seems like it's a necessity. Now at some point, this king might run over f7 and g6 in order to attack this rook, and actually that rook has no squares if the king is on g6. Magnus, he still can protect the rook though. He can play moves like bishop to d1 or g4 like he's played now. And Hikaru, how is he going to continue the game? I think bishop to f4 is very natural to me. Trying to win the h6 pawn, and once one pawn falls, I'm sure more will follow. Also, trading off the rooks wouldn't be a bad idea. Magnus, he plays bishop to b3, attacking the pawn on d5. This knight jumps in. Judging from Magnus repeatedly looking at the clock, it looks like he's down to seconds. He plays bishop to d1, stopping the knight from coming into f3 and forking the king and the rook. And now Hikaru, he's thinking of what to take the pawn on h6 with. He takes with the rook. After a few trades, Magnus Carlsen, he's looking at his clock. He doesn't know what to play. He plays bishop to c2. He slams the clock, but he's out of time. You can check out more commentary on my channel. Thanks for watching.